Before I begin this program, just a few pieces of news about the situation with this channel. Firstly, as you will see behind me, there's various dust sheets over the furniture, things of that kind. The reason for this is that, as some of you may recall, there was a severe power cut in my house on the eve of Christmas, and the result is that the house has to be completely comprehensively rewired, and these works have now begun. In order to facilitate these works, my wife and I are going to be leaving the house with our children and our dogs and going to a place in the country. We will be returning to London on Wednesday, when hopefully the works, or at least most of them, will have been done. I will be in internet contact throughout that period, and my full expectation is that I will be able to continue to provide daily updates, though of course I can't absolutely guarantee that. It is likely, however, that those updates may be a little shorter, or perhaps a lot shorter than normal, which I suspect some of you might anyway prefer. I also fully intend to continue to make videos for the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and to obviously continue the work of the Duran. So that's one thing. The second is returning now to a rather unhappy subject. A number of you have again contacted me about various channels that have been appearing again on YouTube, using my material, purporting to be connected to me in some way. This has become a tiresome and exhausting thing. It's a little bit like the Greek monster from mythology, the Hydra. When you lop off one head, two others grow in its place. It does sometimes feel a bit like that. I'm afraid this is the latest cycle of these channels. Again, I'm doing, at the Duran, we're doing everything we can to bring this situation under control. Hopefully, at some point, it will be fully resolved. But just to reiterate one more time, the only place where you can find my work is on this channel, Alexander Mercouris, and on the Duran. From time to time, I do appear as a guest on other channels, but when I do that, that's obvious. So in the meantime, please disregard all of these channels that are appearing all over YouTube. And could I also ask you, if you can find the time, to report the existence of these channels to YouTube and to report them for imposture. So thank you for that, and again apologies that I'm frankly very mortified that I have to make this request again. As I said, this has been an ongoing problem. Let's turn now to the situation, and the situation, there are two very, very big news stories dominating the world media today. One is the situation, the ongoing situation in Ukraine, which will be the main topic of this program. The other is the indictment of Donald Trump, which has now taken place. And this is a topic which I'm going to discuss fully in a live stream on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and also, of course, with Robert Barnes, who is a practicing American lawyer, is somebody who is especially expert to discuss this topic. So I'm not going to discuss the Donald Trump issue today. What I propose to do today is to discuss the military situation in Ukraine, certain diplomatic overtures that the Zelensky government may be making, and I really want to stress the word may be making, and also briefly touch on Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen's trips, separate trips, even though they're going there at the same time, to Beijing. let's talk about the military situation in Ukraine first. And here we are now getting a cascade of news suggesting that the Ukrainians were forced, admitting by the Ukrainians that they were forced to pull out of the center of Bakhmut because of the very real risk that if their troops had been left there, they would have been trapped there. And there is now growing talk that the Ukrainians have finally decided that they're going to try and extract their troops from Bakhmut. They're going to finally pull out. They've now accepted that Bakhmut is irretrievably lost and that the chances of continuing to cling on to Bakhmut have now essentially gone. And there's been a comment about this from President Zelensky himself. And this was said at a news conference by Zelensky in Poland, where he is currently on a state visit. He said this with President Duda of Poland by his side. He said, "We maintain presence in Bakhmut. General Syrski is in charge of the operational situation there. If there's a point that the situation gets even hotter, a threat arises that troops will be lost due to an encirclement, then certainly there will be relevant, appropriate decisions by the general at the scene." Now, note that Zelensky is not saying here that the Ukrainians are definitely going to pull out from Bakhmut. He's saying that will only happen if there's a danger that they might get encircled. And note also that he's throwing the entire weight of the decision upon General Syrski. He's been making it very clear for weeks, months, that he wants Ukrainian troops to hold out until the end, to the bitter end in Bakhmut. But he's now saying that if General Syrski decides that the troops should be pulled out, that he's not going to stand in the way. Now, given how strong a position he's historically taken over Bakhmut, I have to say I feel that is something of an abdication of responsibility. If it is indeed the Ukrainian intention to pull troops out of Bakhmut, then I think President Zelensky, properly speaking, should go back to Kiev, go on national television. He does so regularly anyway, make an address to the Ukrainian people, formally tell them that Ukraine has to pull its troops out of Bakhmut because the situation for those troops has now become unbearable, and take that responsibility himself and make it clear that it is his decision. He should also, of course, thank the troops for their sacrifice. Whether he will do any of these things, in light of this comment, it seems to me now looks unlikely. But there we are. First hint from Zelensky, first real hint from Zelensky, that Ukrainian troops may have to pull out from Bakhmut, though he's doing it in a way that anybody in Ukraine who is unhappy with that decision, well, they're being in effect invited to blame General Syrski. I do wonder, by the way, whether General Syrski's position might fairly soon come under challenge. In the meantime, another Ukrainian general, a retired Ukrainian general, General Kriponos, who has made some rather negative comments about the Ukrainian military's conduct of the war, has now given an interview in which he says that, in his opinion, Bakhmut should have been evacuated back in February. There was no military logic in clinging on to Bakhmut beyond February, and he essentially criticizes Zelensky and the Ukrainian military leadership for engaging in what you might call meat grinder tactics. Meat grinder tactics in which General Kriponos says it's the Ukrainians who have lost their best troops, whilst the Russians have preserved theirs. So there might be a row in Ukraine over any pullback from Bakhmut, and of course it hasn't yet happened. Now, I should say that multiplicity of reports from both sides is now saying that fighting in Bakhmut has intensified, that the Wagner organization is pushing hard towards the Ukrainians in the western part of Bakhmut. It's also continuing with its offensive in Bogdanovka, where allegedly it's actually managed to establish a physical presence in the village, in other words, capture a part of the village. It's also suggesting that there's also reports that the Russians are now pushing hard on Orekhovo, Vasilievka, and that they're still fighting for Ivanivskaya and Khromovo. So all sorts of fighting continues to go on in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut will have to undertake a fighting retreat. Never an easy thing to do. And if they're going to escape, they're going to have to escape through a narrow funnel, one which is going to be, however, shelled on one which is being shelled by Russian artillery. Against that, if they stay in Bakhmut, I'm told that the area that they still control inside Bakhmut has no more than a circumference of around 5 kilometers. So it's now very small. The Russians can concentrate artillery upon this small area. It would be reckless, suicidal to try to cling on. Of course, there is a third option, which is that they might decide to try to negotiate the terms of their withdrawal from the Russians. Perhaps they might even lay down their arms. But to be frank, I don't think that's going to happen. So realistically, they either fight on to the last and get killed or wounded or captured by the Russians, or what I'm starting to think is most likely to happen, they will try to pull back with Zelensky blaming General Syrski for the fact that this has happened. So that's what I want to say about the situation in Bakhmut today. There has been more news from other battle fronts. It seems that the Russians are still incrementally pushing around Avdiivka, though, as I said, I think the weight of the battle for the Russians has, over the last couple of days, been on clearing up, finally ending this long battle in Bakhmut itself. Any plans the Russians might have had for a grander encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut has clearly been abandoned. I suspect that those large Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived in Bakhmut or near Bakhmut 3 weeks ago probably convinced the Russian command that this was perhaps an unattainable thing, and that the Russians want to sort out the issue of Bakhmut before the Ukrainians begin their offensive, which could happen, of course, at any time. We'll come to that in a moment. But there's been some more interesting news from Vyhledar and Marinka. First of all, the Russians claim again that they're making more advances in Marinka. Well, they've been saying this for weeks now, and it is very difficult to get an accurate picture of what's going on in Marinka. I'm not going to debate it in any further detail. But there was some interesting and rather tantalizing news from Vyhledar. The first is that it seems to me that Russian aircraft, aviation, Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers are now operating around Vyhledar, and they're launching these precision-guided bombs on Ukrainian positions in Vyhledar. I've discussed many times that the Russians have been, that the most effective way to break defenses is to bomb them rather than to shell them. The fact that the Russians haven't been able to bomb Ukrainian defenses because of the potency of Ukraine's legacy era air defense system has been perhaps the single most important factor in slowing down this entire operation. It's now, I think, quite clear that the key priority of the attacks, the missile attacks on Ukraine's energy system, was to force Ukraine to expend air defense missiles, defending something, Ukraine's energy system, which Ukraine had no option but to defend, depleting the number of missiles in that system, causing the missile launchers to reveal themselves, opening themselves up thereby to attack by the Russian Air Force. And it seems that the Russians now sense that the air defense system, the Ukrainian air defense system, is now so depleted, or is sufficiently depleted, that they can risk carrying out airstrikes with high altitude bombers upon Ukrainian positions using these glided bombs. And it looks as if they're starting to do that in Vyhledar itself. And I've also seen a report that Russian air defense troops are now starting to position themselves close to Vyhledar, which is interesting because it seems as if the Russians may be anticipating some kind of counterstrike by the Ukrainian Air Force. But anyway, they're bringing their own air defense troops closer to Vyhledar, presumably in anticipation of a Russian attack on the town, another Russian attack on the town, one which will be perhaps supported by these bombers, and one which, through the deployment of air defense assets, is intended to close the airspace around Vyhledar to any Ukrainian aircraft. Now, I say that a couple of days ago, Ukraine was claiming that it was in possession of 72 MiG-29s, largely donated by Poland and Slovakia. I was a little skeptical about that report. It seems the skepticism might have been justified. Poland has just announced on the occasion of Zelensky's visit to Poland that Poland is donating another 4 MiG-29s to Ukraine. It's quite clear to me that only a fraction of these fighter jets have actually arrived in Ukraine up to this time. And anyway, we will see what happens. But the fact that the Russians are, as I said, forward deploying air defense assets does suggest that they are being wary about possible strikes by the Ukrainian Air Force. And bear in mind that there's confirmation that the United States has supplied JDAM bombs to Ukraine and has attempted to integrate them. These are gliding bombs, precision-guided gliding bombs to Ukraine, has attempted to integrate them with these MiG-29 fighters. And the point is, and I said this in an earlier program, that the Russians possess extremely potent air defense assets, and fighter jets, MiG-29s, trying to launch JDAM bombs are at serious risk of being shot down by this Russian air defense system. And I suspect it's partly to prevent attacks by MiG-29s with JDAMs that the Russians are forward deploying air defense assets near Vyhledar, if of course they actually are, and if that report is indeed correct. I would point out that the latest versions of the Buk air defense missile system, operated both by Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine operates a version of the Buk missile system that was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and deployed in the 1980s, whereas modern versions of the Buk system operated by Russia are very different indeed. They are much, much more powerful. Russian versions of the Buk missile system can certainly intercept aircraft at the kind of distances and the sort of altitudes that would be needed in order to prevent them launching JDAM bombs. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the battlefronts. It does look as if, as I said, the battle for Bakhmut is indeed now at the very end of its end game, and we will probably see the entire town pass under Russian control within the next few days. Now, I mentioned Zelensky's comments about a possible pullback from Bakhmut, very, as I said, qualified comments. There's been a big report in the Financial Times which reads, Ukraine ready to talk to Russia on Crimea if counteroffensive succeeds. And we are told that Andrei Sibika, deputy head of the Zelensky's office, in other words, someone close to Zelensky, has said this: it will be, if we succeed in achieving our strategic goals on the battlefield, and when we will be on the administrative border with Crimea, we are ready to open a diplomatic page to discuss this issue. It doesn't mean that we exclude the way of liberation by our army. Now, some are interpreting this as a sign that Zelensky is prepared to recognize the loss of Crimea. I have to say that is not my impression. My own impression is that what Zelensky, through his officials, are saying is the same thing that many Ukrainian officials have already been saying. If, and it is an important if, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful, if they break through to Crimea's administrative borders, then they're prepared to sit down with the Russians and get the Russians to agree to hand over Crimea to them. If that doesn't happen, then Ukraine leaves itself open the option of marching on to Crimea. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is any of these are realistic scenarios. I'm simply saying that Ukraine has said this before. I don't think that Sibika is saying anything different from comments that Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky himself, by the way, have made in the past. So I just want to put that on record because there was a flurry of reports yesterday that Ukraine might be prepared to give up Crimea or rather recognize the loss of Crimea and resume negotiations with the Russians. To be totally frank, I just don't see that in these comments. It's something which the Ukrainians might eventually be forced to do, but I don't see that that's what these comments say at all. And I just want to put that on record. Anyway, what about the Ukrainian counter-offensive? Well, the United States published another big arms package yesterday. I'm going to leave it to Brian Belletti to take it apart. I didn't see anything there that could possibly be of material use in this counter-offensive.